Now we're ready to attach the dress section to the bodice. Really what you want to do is just make sure you know which side is the front and which side is the back. For me, the best way to do that is to fold the dress section in half so that I see the side panel nice and flat. And when it curves up, I know that's my front. This little notch here is my side seam. So I also have my bodice, and I'm going to do the same thing. Now that I know this is the front, I'm going to fold it in half with the front on the left side and match up my side seam with my notch. So again, it's going to be right sides together. You're going to want to make sure you're just, attaching one single layer of the bodice. This is not the facing, the bodice section, and fold it right sides together. And again, I always like to start right here at the side seam. Now you're just going to be pinning all the way around. The bodice will have notches. This notch will match up to where the gathering starts in the front. And there's a notch that's going to match up to where the gathering starts in the back. Just work your way around, making sure that the bodice facing is kind of out of the way. Finding your center. This is my center back, so my center back notches. There they are. This is my side back notch. At my other side seam. Side seam matches a notch at the side panel. This is the side front. I have to make sure the dress is actually inside. And now we're ready to attach the center front. So here's where we're kind of redistributing our gathers. Just looking for the notch. Here's the center front. And I'm going to sew the same way that I did before, where I actually have the gathers facing up towards me. So I can just kind of move them as I'm sewing along, making sure they're nice and even. I'll come back and show you the bodice attached to the dress. Here you can see I've attached the bodice to the dress. This seam right here doesn't need to be finished because it's going to be enclosed. So the next step would be to go over to your iron, press the seam allowance up so it's towards the bodice, and remove all of the visible basting stitches. Now we're ready to finish our bodice by edge stitching or stitching in the ditch. That just means stitching exactly where there's already a seam. So what we do is we make sure that the seam allowance is pressed up and that the facing is turned under and covers that seam. And then we take a pin, and I like to stitch in the ditch. So I take my pin and I double check that it's catching the facing. So that way you know when you're sewing right there, you'll catch the facing and it will be completely enclosed. So I'm just going to take my time and pin around the entire bodice before I go to my sewing machine. I've added pins all the way around my bodice. I'm going to go sew right in the ditch. For this step, I'm actually going to switch my thread so that it completely matches. I've used like a lighter white color for the purpose of a sew along, but I want to make sure the stitching is essentially invisible. So I'll do that. Just one tip when you are sewing the seam, don't like pull or twist as it's going through the sewing machine. You just kind of want to let the machine do its thing so that your bodice isn't twisted. So now I am ready to attach the bodice. We're edge stitching the top. As I mentioned before, I'm going to stitch in the ditch, which is right at the seam line. As I'm sewing, although I'm not pulling or twisting, I am a little bit pulling apart the seam just to make sure the stitches fall right inside of that seam. You can see that by stitching the ditch, your stitching is pretty much invisible. You can see it a little bit here, but for the most part, you don't notice it at all from the front. And then you're just gonna wanna make sure you check that you've caught the facing all the way around. If you haven't, just go back and you know, reattach it where it hasn't. You can also hand stitch this if you're worried about visible stitches, or you can edge stitch it where it's actually visible on the bodice. Either way is fine. Any of those options work. So all there is left to do is to press this bodice just to give it a nice press, and then we're going to move on to the hem.